coming in. But I'd like to introduce Guy Standing, who co-founded the Basic Income Earth Network and now serves as its honorary president. He's held professorships at the University of Bath and at SOAS, was Programme Director at the International Labour Organization, and has advised the UN, World Bank and governments around the world on labour and social policy. He is the author of the best-selling The Precariat and the New Dangerous Class, and is a fellow of the Academy of Sciences. I love the title of his latest book, Battling 8 Giants, being a great fan of Scots and Irish traditional stories. Battling giants is one of my favourite topics. So Battling 8 Giants, Basic Income Now, is available from Bloomsbury with a 30% discount. Will you please welcome Guy Standing?
Thank you very much, Janet. And I should begin, now you've said that, by saying I had a great battle with the publisher to keep the title Battling 8 Giants, because they said nobody would understand it, but I thought it was appropriate.
Yeah.
I would like to talk, and a real bore is someone who's written a book and think it's important. But if you've written 4 books, you are really a bore. And what I'm going to address in the next few minutes are themes that actually come from the set. And I think they are collectively critical for making the breakthrough that I believe the Greens can achieve in the next few years. And I trace basic income to the Charter of the Forest of 1217, which asserted that everybody, every commoner, has a right to subsistence in the commons. And I wrote a book called The Plunder of the Commons, saying that essentially over the ages, our commons have been illegitimately taken away from us. And the essence leads to a charter of the commons, which is a green ecological charter leading up to a justification as a basic income paid out of a commons fund that we build up from levies on pollution and other things taking from the commons. And I was very pleased that Caroline Lucas came as a discussant for the book launch in October with David Lammy, who's also a supporter of basic income. But I believe that the Green Party now has been gifted an opportunity again. I'm sorry to say this, and apologies to Jonathan, who may or may not be there, an opportunity because the Labour leadership, the new Labour leadership, has come out saying they are not in favour of a basic income at this time of the coronavirus. I think that's a shocking abdication. And I was working with John McDonnell last year, and I produced a report for him, which is the foundation of the second book, the one you're talking about. And Ed Miliband came along to the launch. He's a friend, and he came out and he said, yes, we must go forward on this. John did. Jonathan Reynolds, the new shadow Department of Work and Pensions, he has told me and has said it in public, he supports a basic income. And yet when it gets to the crunch, they come out with a statement saying it would be misguided to go with it now. Next year, the Green Party should be able to distribute leaflets reminding everybody that it was the first national party to be in favor of a basic income, because it will be a powerful message. There's just been an opinion poll which showed that 84% of people are in favor of the introduction of a basic income in this crisis. And it's going to be a critical theme. Imagine if you could go around with a simple leaflets saying, we were the first and we believe it must be part of the resilience strategy that we need. I think that's a very critical background point to bear in mind. Now, the second theme after the commons, I wrote a book called The Corruption of Capitalism. And Jonathan is 100% right, because what we've seen in the last 30 years is the emergence of a system of rentier capitalism. where more and more of the income flows to the owners of property, physical, financial, intellectual property. And less has been going to people who perform labor. The share going to labor has gone down, down, and down, as I show in the book. And unless we have a strategy for dismantling rentier capitalism, we will not have a politically feasible progressive strategy. And that includes dismantling all the subsidies that have been encouraging resource depletion and pollution and all the rest that you know about. So that book is the context of the third theme. And the third theme is that because of rentier capitalism and the policies of austerity, we have seen the strengthening of 8 giants. And it was very interesting that the book came out on March the 23rd. Obviously, it was completed before the pandemic struck. But in effect, you can say that the pandemic is the 9th giant, or the trigger to the collapse of the economic system of rentier capitalism. Let me explain that. The 8 giants, and I'm drawing on imagery of William Beveridge in his famous 1942 book, report, where he had, we need to slay 5 giants. And this is a time for revolutions, not for patching. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that, and I discuss his 5 giants in the book. But today we have 8 modern giants on top of his 5. And the 8 begin with inequality. We have chronic inequalities that are greater than at any time of any of our lifetimes. And the inequality of wealth is much, much greater than the inequality of income. In fact, wealth has grown from 300% of GDP to 700% now, before the pandemic struck. And wealth inequality has grown enormously. But very critically for our argument, over 60% of all wealth in Britain is inherited wealth. If I'm not mistaken, you could call that something for nothing. And often people criticize basic income for saying, we don't believe in something for nothing. Ian Duncan Smith has said that so many times I feel like punching him in the nose. I do for other reasons as well, but we won't go into that. Now, the inequality also has an ecological orientation. There's ecological inequalities. The rich are the polluters, the poor are the sufferers, in health terms and in other respects. So the giant of inequality, which I document in the book, has grown larger and larger and is fueling the other giants. And the second giant is insecurity. We have an economic system which requires and forces people to put up with chronic insecurity. And the character of insecurity is today much more about uncertainty than anything that you can insure. I'm an economist, and you can't insure against uncertainty. So we're prone to be hit by shocks and hazards and have much greater difficulty with coping with them and recovering them. I document that giant. It's obviously something with which many of you are very familiar. But the third giant is debt. A lie was told after the financial crisis in 2008 that the crisis was caused by public debt. That was a lie. As we now know, and I document the various studies that have shown it, it's fundamentally about private debt. And here, there's a lesson to be learned from the Spanish flu of 100 years ago. The Spanish flu killed over 50 million people, but was actually not followed by an economic slump. I believe this pandemic will be followed by a terrible economic slump. And the key to understanding that is the growth of debt. At the time of the Spanish flu, in the United States, private debt was about 50% of national income. Corporate debt was non-existent. And so when the Spanish flu started to decline, the US economy was able to pull the rest of the world back into some sort of growth. It wasn't very good, but into some form of growth. Today, at the beginning of the pandemic, before the pandemic, United States private debt was over 150% of GDP, much more than at the height of the Great Depression. And corporate debt was 3/4 of GDP. In those circumstances, you only have to have a small decline, and it leads to multiplier effects, huge economic collapse. In Britain, our private debt today is at record levels. Corporate debt, ditto. So the debt is going to be a trigger to a much worse economic crisis unless we have really sensible economics policies. The fourth giant is something that stems from the previous three, and that is stress. We have a pandemic of stress again before the pandemic started. I give a lot of statistics about how stressed out we are as a society. And when Jonathan mentioned that one of the things that he wanted to see emphasized by the Greens is the terrifying increase in domestic violence, that was already happening. And we are seeing that since the pandemic and the lockdown started, in France, for example, domestic violence has increased by 1/3, over 30%. And when the statistics start to come in Britain, that will be the case. Now, ironically, our pilots and other people's pilots have shown that if you have individualized basic incomes, it leads to a lot of women choosing independence rather than putting up with domestic violence. It gives them the means to be independent. And that is an essential ingredient if we're going to combat domestic violence. And I think that that is going to be a hidden, powerful argument that ordinary people will be able to understand. Now, the stress leads to something that is really horrifying, but which is well documented. A shrinking of the mental bandwidth is the psychological term that they use. And it leads to people not being able to be reasonable, rational, and long-term in their thinking. It's not because they have character defects, it's because of all of these other giants producing these effects. After stress, the fifth giant, about which I've written too many things, I dare say, is precarity. The sense of the precariat. I cannot tell you, the book's been translated in 24 languages. I get invited all over the world until this pandemic shut us all down. There are millions out there who understand being in the precariat is like. The Greens should be the party of the precariat, because the precariat is defined by living bits and pieces lives, but losing rights, losing the rights of citizenship. That's the theme I've been emphasizing. It's not about unstable labor, as commentators seem to think. It's about you being a denizen, about losing the rights of being a citizen. And that is so fundamental. The next giant is the robots. Now, in a different social context, many of the technological changes could be liberating, could be ecologically helpful, could be beneficial, but in the context of rentier capitalism, it becomes a great disruptor. Automation makes lives more insecure, more inequality, and so on. So I won't go into that, the book does, but it's the seventh giant, which I've said in the book would be the tipping point, where I believe will make millions more supportive of basic income. And that is what Jonathan was talking about, the Extinction Rebellion. I believe the ecological crisis will force more people who are not naturally on our side to come round to being on our side. And the reason is that we need ecological taxes. We need much higher carbon taxes. Economists around the world are fairly united in knowing that we need higher carbon taxes. But there's a problem. The problem is that carbon taxes by themselves are regressive. They tend to increase inequality, and taxes are unpopular. Ergo, we have to say you can only introduce higher carbon taxes if you promise to recycle the revenue from that in the form of carbon dividends, green dividends, basic income payments. And once you do that, then suddenly carbon taxes become politically popular, as they're finding in British Columbia, for example, and in Switzerland, where I am now. We have high carbon taxes, but they're all redistributed to the people. We get it in our financial statements each year, and it's popular, very popular. So we need it. We need those taxes only if we have a basic income. And the second, and something that is really fundamental to all my beliefs, is that a basic income will help tilt people's choices away from resource depleting labor in jobs to resource preserving work, care work, unpaid voluntary work, voluntary ecological work, all the things that many of us want to do more, but because we don't have the economic security, there is pressure on us to do less. So we have a huge care deficit, as we're seeing now in this crisis, and we're destroying resources rather than preserving resources. I think a basic income is vital to encourage us to change our lifestyles. And the eighth giant is neo-fascist populism. I think we're seeing the implosion of its leading character on the other side of the Atlantic right now. Caligula is going mad. Caligula is, any time now he'll bring in his white horse, but we are seeing this neo-fascist tendency everywhere. Boris Johnson would not have been elected had there not been this populist fear, where they listen to the sirens, where the enemy is the other, the migrant, the Muslim, the Jew, whatever it might be. And populism is a festering, and it won't go away because of this virus, and probably it will be intensified. So these are the 8 giants. For me, as I said the other day in a speech which has been quoted, this particular line, it's a no-brainer. We need a basic income. It's gone from being ethically desirable to being ethically desirable and economically vital. And it's particularly vital given that the government has moved its fiscal policy into the most regressive policy ever invented in our lifetime. It's an extraordinary policy. I don't understand how any self-respecting person can morally defend what the Chancellor has been doing. The Chancellor has said, in effect, that he will give a rich income earner £2,000 a month, and someone in the precariat, they'll get about £400. And someone who's unemployed or on the margins of society, they'll get an extra £20 a week. Oh, fantastic. Think of the regressive impact, and particularly as they are continuing to say with universal credit and legacy benefits that the people have to look for jobs, look for work, so they say. Whereas you get your £2,000 only if you do not do any work. That's the policy. I've written in the Financial Times last week documenting that is the policy. It's most regressive and stupid. So instead of giving people the inducements to pick up work, do part-time work, do whatever, you might as well stay at home and you get your £2,000. This is a crazy policy. So we are in a situation now, I believe, where we can say morally, I believe in a basic income. I believe in a basic income because the wealth and income of all of us, every single one of us here, is far more to do with the efforts and achievements of all those people who went before us. than anything we've done ourselves. And if we allow private inheritance, we should allow a social inheritance, a sort of social dividend on our collective wealth. Whenever I explain that at length to an audience, you see nodding, because people get the morality of that. It's not a something for nothing, it's a something for being a citizen, for being a person in our community. And the second moral reason is it would enhance freedom. Your freedom, my freedom, the freedom to say no to abuse or to bureaucratic lack of due process, as we're seeing in universal credit. And the freedom to be moral, which is so fundamental to a progressive agenda. And the third ethical reason, and the one on which I'll end, is it would give people basic security. And basic security is a public good. You having it doesn't deprive me of having it. And in fact, if we all have basic security, the value increases for all of us. And basic security is essential for the resilience that we're going to need in the coming months and years. And I believe the Greens can be the party of resilience. It's a lovely slogan, I feel. You talk about resilience at a personal level, you can withstand shocks if you've got resilience. At a societal level, you can withstand shocks if your community has the capacity to respond and has enough security to rebuild and try to recover. I think it's a vital policy, and I hope the Greens don't back down one little inch. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Guy. What a great, compelling laying out of the case for UBI. That's great. We do have some questions coming through now, and I think Ruth has been taking note of those. So maybe I could introduce Ruth Love into the conversation, and she could give us a resume of some of the questions and see if Guy would like to answer them. Are you there, Ruth? Brilliant. Okay.
Here. Can you see me?
We can see you.
Oh, can you? Well, that's good, because I can't see me.
You can see your blue scarf.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes, that's me. That's me. Got the right person here. So, Guy, can I just say, I think everybody was just listening. I think we're all mesmerized. So thank you very much. So anyway, the first question is, given the government committed to universal credit, how do you think we should most effectively introduce basic income?
Well, I make no bones about it in the books, and this is the Battling Giants. I've got a whole chapter. I call it the immorality of universal credit. I do not believe that universal credit is up. I believe it should be scrapped as quickly as possible. Its foundations are fundamentally illiberal and regressive. They're punitive, deliberately so. Ian Duncan Smith basically introduced sanctions. The 6-week wait, now 5, is cruel because many people don't get it until 12 weeks or more. The sanctions regime is vicious. We've had over 5 million claimants who've been sanctioned. And most of them, when they eventually get to an appeal, have the sanctions overturned because they weren't guilty of what they were accused by some junior bureaucrat who is, there's no due process. It's fundamentally against Magna Carta. It's not defensible. There's no due process. And it is a disgrace. So for my mind, I don't like a scheme that's going to be dependent on the universal credit system. I think we've got to get to a simplicity thing. I think there's a question on ID and so on that's coming up. But I think that we've got to move away as far as we can from the universal credit system.
Okay. The next one was, how do you think the Greens should plan a basic income campaign now that Labour has cooled? And Andrew Cooper very helpfully suggested that if we'd had a citizen's income by now, that possibly would have made furloughing unnecessary. But
I think, Ruth, that whoever asked this question probably knows his or her answer as well. I think we're going to see in the next few months all the holes of the mishmash that the government has introduced, with a lot of suffering with people who will not qualify for one or other of these benefits that they're throwing in. One week it's fishermen, the next it'll be lollipop attendants or something that needs special help, and it's a bit ad hocery is the order of the day. I think as the ad hocery goes on and the billions of pounds that are being spent on these schemes get squandered and all the inefficiencies that I touched on earlier, I think that more and more people will join that 84% who are in favor of basic income. I think we've got to say that if there's any group left out in this, what I call the rescue phase, if any group is left out, we're all made more vulnerable, because social illnesses will spread, as well as the probability of a second and third round of the coronavirus, and the fragility that I was talking about earlier in the economic system will only intensify. I think eventually those in the Labour Party who do favour a basic income, like Jonathan, like Ed, and so on, will have their voice heard. Clive Lewis is a friend of mine. He's been saying he's very disappointed they've gone in the wrong way. That's their problem, okay? I think there is this opening now for the Green Party to be the party saying transparency, basic security, these must be the priority. And it's no good they saying that the job retention scheme is protecting living standards, because somebody who's earning £2,500 a month, who has a 20% cut in their income, is not the same as somebody who's earning £600 a month and he has 20% cut in income. That will tip them into unsustainable debt, homelessness, social violence, domestic violence, all of these things that go with the syndrome of insecurity. And I think that this lesson is something that the Greens must hammer home, hammer home, hammer home, and remind as many people as possible, we were the party who first said we must have a basic income as part, not a panacea, as part of the response. Because you will not recover unless we are all more resilient. That's the key word, I think.
Absolutely. Another question is that the Chancellor recently stated that high government debt is not a problem because interest rates are so low and therefore we do not even need to worry about balancing the books. They then go to ask, is it worth the pain of austerity? I think we know the answer to that one. But also then, is there a move by the Chancellor to write off our debt country?
Well, I think, again, the Greens have to be the party that ram it home that this government has members of this government who voted dutifully for austerity from 2010 onwards. They voted to see cuts in our commons. They voted to see cuts in our health services, etc., etc. Don't let us forget, they created the structural problems that make the effect of the pandemic and the economic slump so much worse than they would have been. So let's start with that. We let them not get away with it, all right? And then we say, okay, rebuilding our commons. I've got a 44-article charter, how we can rebuild our commons. And I believe that 44 articles should be part of a green strategy. And Caroline was very supportive of that in being the discussant. So for me, it's an opening. Let's not use Jonathan's favorite no word. It's an opening for a new progressive strategy driven by values of ecological sustainability and revival, but also societal revival, making us all more resilient and helping to have a better lifestyle. You know, we certainly don't want to go back to rentier capitalism. We want to dismantle rentier capitalism, and we should be exposing the disgusting characteristics of that. It is a disgrace that the Duke of Buccleuch, I love saying his name, always like to say it, the Duke of Buccleuch inherited 277,000 acres of beautiful land in our country because he's the descendant of an illegitimate child of Charles II. And on top of that inheritance has been receiving millions and millions of pounds from the government in subsidies so he can keep his bloody land. Sorry, bad language, but we have a system riddled with things that are feeding rentier capitalism, and we should expose those features, dismantle subsidies, dismantle tax reliefs, which are regressive. Every year, the Treasury sacrifices over 400 billion pounds in regressive tax reliefs, and that's their own figures, their own figures. And if you look at many of these are ecologically bad, they are socially bad, and they are not even economically defensible. And these things are all characteristic of the economic system, which has been increasingly fragile, and is why the crisis we're going to be having economically is so much worse than in 1920. And for me, it's systemic. We've got to tackle rentier capitalism, we've got to tackle those 8 giants, and we've got to get resilience back into the system and the sort of ecological, sustainable, better lifestyle that could come out of it.
Oh. Okay. How do you think universal basic income could help improve mental health?
Well, I allude to that in my talk, but there's a longer section in the book. What we know is that insecurity leads to a shrinking of the mental bandwidth. That's the psychological term. And it leads to a decline in IQ. It leads in more stress, leading to more morbidity, and ultimately those deaths of despair that are creeping into our literature, which I mentioned. And if you don't have basic security, your mental health deteriorates even more than your physical health. And it also feeds into that 8th giant. Those people who are mentally suffering tend to vote for the neo-fascist populists who play on fear, who play on that the problem is the other, and therefore we must defeat the other. And you'll see the arch populist Trump using that card as his desperate effort to be re-elected in November. But we have a mental health crisis. That 4th giant is huge, and it was huge before the pandemic struck. But of course, the pandemic is increasing that domestic violence, the social violence will come later, and the violence we do to ourselves. The violence we do to our bodies and our health, mental health, you will see it get much worse. And that, as that happens, there will be increasing opening for us to be saying, the only way is a better lifestyle. The only way is a slow time, slow food, slowing down, more leisure, more participation in the life of the polis. I've argued that the only condition I would accept for a basic income is that people, when they start receiving it, should make a moral commitment, not a legally binding commitment, a moral commitment to participate in deliberative democracy, to participate in voting in elections, to attending at least one meeting per year of local political groups to discuss political action. I live in a Swiss village. We treat deliberative democracy as just absolutely normal. And it's resulted, so we're in lockdown just like everywhere else, but it's resulted in tremendous organizational capacity of resilience. So it's actually brought out good things. Of course, there are bad things. I don't want to be saying that the good things outweigh the bad. Of course they don't. But it's reminding us of our humanity. It's reminding us that we're only as strong as our community. And that, I think, is a lesson that people right now are beginning to relearn. Let us hope.
Okay. How do we protect the rights of EU citizens and their non-EU families?
Well, I mean, I make no bones about it. I was against Brexit. I think it's an idiotic decision, but it stems from that eighth giant, and the other giants, in my view, was an expression of populism. I do try and be careful. I never use the term universal basic income. I don't use the term citizens basic income. I use the term basic income because for pragmatic reasons, we're going to have, in the short term, we're going to have limits on who would be entitled to receive the basic income. If we want it to be politically acceptable, and if we want it to function, we're going to have to say that it can be received by usually resident citizens and legally resident migrants who've been in the country for a certain amount of time. I don't say that willingly. I say it that we've got it to be pragmatic. We need to help refugees. We need much better policies for helping refugees. We need to help migrants of all persuasions. We need that. But we have to treat those things as a separate policy if we're to get basic income politically through all the progressive channels in our society. I've often seen how the Labour people, I was speaking 4 or 5 times in the Labour Party conference last year, and they always throw it up. Why are you giving it to migrants? Blah, blah, blah. I say, listen, if they are legally in this country and they are part of our family, then of course they should be. But we have to have a qualifying period. So we've got to be pragmatic. But I think ultimately, everybody should be receiving a basic income.
Right. Basic
income. Sorry, Ruth, can I just interrupt quickly? There's a very interesting question at the end here from Shahab to all panelists about running through some of the key criticisms levied by those who are against UBI, and I just think that's quite an interesting thing to stick in here. Could you address that, Guy?
Yeah, in this book, Basic Income and How We Can Make It Happen, which is based on 30 years, I'm sorry to say, 30 years of research and doing pilots in around the world and so on, there's a whole chapter on the 19 objections that have been made to basic income. I think we can answer every single one of them. And particularly the standard ones that, how is it affordable? As I mentioned earlier, you can easily afford it. There are plenty of ways of affording it. Wealth tax, carbon tax, various levies on other things of the commons that I was talking about in that other book. But the other criticism is, of course, that it will make people lazy and it will be a disincentive to work. Now, Vince Cable wrote an article in The Independent 4 weeks ago saying how stupid basic income was. And it coincided with me being asked by the City of London Finance Group to give a talk on my new book. And they said, can you think of anybody who would be a good discussant? So I said, well, why not invite Vince Cable? Okay, he hates basic income. He's written, I've just been talking to him. Please invite Vince Cable. Anyhow, I thought, oh dear, I'm going to have a real tough time, really a tough time, because he hates it and blah, blah, blah. And he said it will then discourage people from working and blah, or, you know, categorical, okay? So he got hold of my book, and when he came on this debate, which was a Zoom debate, it was like a lamb, because he ended up by saying, I'm in favor of basic income pilots. Well, you know, 3 weeks before, he said they would be terrible. And the reason he told me afterwards was he said, your evidence in the books about how it does not act as a disincentive to work convinced me. I thought, wow, that's good. There is plenty of evidence that actually a basic income increases work, not decreases work. And it tilts people to do more of the work that we value, more care work, more voluntary work, more community work, and hardly any change on income earning work. There was a study which I cite, which says that the value of unpaid care work in Britain today, before the pandemic, is 1.24 trillion pounds. Put that in context, that is worth more than all manufacturing and all non-financial services in the country, which is worth just over 1 trillion pounds. If we sensibly recalibrated what we mean by growth, so we can get away from our difficulties with degrowth, then you could see that the value of the unpaid care economy is actually incredible. And one thing that we're seeing now is that more and more people, painfully, are realizing that. Never again should we be allowing them to measure national income without taking due respect for care work. Never again. It is ridiculous, it is sexist, it's hierarchical, it's ecologically wrong. And we should make that a central plank of our rhetoric, those leaflets I was talking about, because the ordinary person is quickly getting it. And they didn't know that you don't value care work in our national income statistics or in our work statistics. You know, but the disgrace of it is being exposed every single day, just as it is with the fact that the people who are doing the heroic work are among the lowest paid and the most insecure and major part of the precariat. So I think the dialogue and the tone and the vocabulary and the imagery are all going to be profoundly changed in our direction. And that's why I feel that green left is the future. If we can do what we should be doing well enough, and supporting Jonathan and Caroline and the others, then I think the future could be very exciting politically. But of course, we've got to get that resilience first, and the unfolding tragedy, I'm afraid, is going to get worse rather than better this year.
Guy, do you have a view on whether the state should assume control of all businesses that get a bailout during this crisis?
Well, that reminds me of a debate that took place after the 2008 crisis, when disgracefully they bought into the banks, but only to help the banks get back. And then they got rid of their shares. And so the government stepped back. I think it would have been a wonderful opportunity for the public to say, okay, we're investing, saving you. We want a long-term stake in that process. It's the same with the water facilities and things. I was working with John last year, and that was one of the policies on which we had strong agreement. And that I think we've got to rethink how the public, the commons, because it's about the commons really, are back in the center of the debate. Go back to the Charter of the Forest, go back to the great subversive movements throughout our history, and they have been about recovering the commons. When I talk to groups about the plunder of the commons, across classes, middle class, precariat, even some of the elite, they get it, they get it. And I think it's a very strong card for us, the revival of the commons, revival of the commons. And that's how I would put it.
Yeah, funnily enough, my nephew who lives up on the Isle of Lewis was telling me just a couple of years ago about them wondering whether they were going to lose a field that had been used as common land for cattle grazing and for sheep. And it just brings back all those questions about the enclosures and
Sure.
what happened at that point. We lost a lot then.
Well, I go into that in the book. I have 5 types of commons. Natural commons, which you've just been talking about. Social commons, all the social amenities and social facilities bequeathed to us by past generations. Civil commons, cultural commons, and the knowledge commons. And funnily enough, I was asked by the OECD this past week to write a piece based on the book for celebration of World Multilateralism Day. I bet you all knew that Friday was World Multilateralism Day. I can see you all nodding, yes, of course. But the essence of it is losing our commons through the austerity era in particular weakened society's resilience when it came to this mass systemic shock. I just launched a campaign with our international network of Bien. We have networks in 37 countries now. And I've asked them all, can you send me more examples of how the loss of your commons in different countries has accentuated the fragility of our economic and social system in the case of this shock. And already I'm getting a whole lot of cases. It's a global thing, but under the austerity program of Osborne and his pals, it was very bad in Britain and shocking. And I was very pleased that Caroline spoke at the launch, and she really empathized with the whole theme of the book.
Okay, one question is about citizens' income has been gaining support across the world, including the US. So it's been quite easy to frame it as something that we need now to address the crisis, but how do we prevent it from being an emergency-only solution?
I've had an article in the Spanish newspaper a couple of months ago saying that once one country introduces a basic income, whether it's for emergency, as you're talking, or any other reason, once one country does it, I believe we will see dominoes falling quite rapidly. I'm exhausted in the sense that the last 6 weeks, I've been inundated with media requests from all over the world. It's just incredible. And some days 8 or 10. I'm not a political leader like Jonathan or Natalie was, or Caroline. I'm just a plain old-fashioned economist. But the groundswell of support for basic income makes me think that whereas in the previous moments when we could have had it, when I've been advocating it back to 1986, where we could have had it at various times, it was only a 5 to 10% probability. This time, I think genuinely we have a 50% probability of getting it. We won't get it unless we put pressure on politicians who've got spaghetti backbones. I mean, the spaghetti backbone factor should never be forgotten, just as we've seen it with the Labour leadership last week. But I think with such popular support out there, in the precariat in particular, that we have a damn good chance of getting it this time. And the young, particularly the young educated part of the precariat, they want it. And they want it because it will help them fulfill their dreams and aspirations and give them the entry point to a better lifestyle. That's even before the pandemic. So for me, we do have a chance, but it's going to depend on how much priority, how much energy, and those leaflets I mentioned right at the beginning, they could help in a big way. There's a lot of support out there.
I was just going to ask, Guy, do you think that the trials that have been done in several cities around the world have been helpful, or in some ways have they done harm because of their temporary status?
Well, you're looking, Janet, at a very strange man. Somebody who not only believes in something, but has had the opportunity to test it. And not only test it once, but to be involved in designing and carrying out pilots in 4 continents. You have to be a real masochist to do that sort of thing. I summarize the pilots in the 2 books, and I think there have been about, let us say, 20, 25 that could be called proper pilots. Many of them have defects, like the Finnish one was only for unemployed, and that's not a proper basic income. The Manitoba one was abandoned. The Ontario one, right-wing government abandoned it. But we got the evidence. And what is remarkable is that in every single pilot, different types in different types of country have come out with the same type of positive effects. I did a podcast last week for a program run by some NHS doctors. It's called The Doctor's Breakfast. And I asked people, should I do this? And they said, yeah, you should. So I did it. And they turned out to be very empathetic. And actually, I don't recommend you to watch it because I broke down towards the end. Because we have seen in pilot after pilot, similar positive effects. Improvements in nutrition, improvement in health, improvement in school attendance and performance, improvements in women's status, less social violence, domestic and otherwise, more economic activity. How many times do we have to show these results before those spaghetti backbones begin to stiffen? And I genuinely believe, I got a beautiful video sent yesterday from some unknown person. I don't know who it was. If you're interested, I could send you it. But it summarizes the arguments. I just feel we're on the cusp. As I said before, it's up to the Jonathans and the politicians to forge the vocabulary and the imagery so that we get over the edge. And I think we'll do it.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have one last question, Ruth, that's come up from either the panelists or from the participants?
Someone's just said, please send the video. You'll have to send me an email so I can send it.
Somebody, you were talking about young people and the impact of young people, and there was a question about property and what's going to happen with property through it all. I think that's more of a question for the Green Party leadership than it was for yourself. And the question was, will there be consequences for the housing market, particularly for first-time buyers? I don't know whether that's something you feel.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to have huge effects on the housing market, some good, some bad. We need to approach this in the rescue phase, that's this year, in terms of demanding that the homeless and rough sleepers are provided with decent accommodation. That's our first priority. But the housing market must be reformed. We need to strengthen our social housing big time, okay? We all agree on that, I think. And it's exposed the speculative rentier capitalism nature of our property market. I have a whole chapter in The Corruption of Capitalism on how the government deliberately has been subsidizing landlords and subsidizing people who have been acquiring dozens of properties, keeping many of them empty, many of them owned by foreign property corporations, by the likes of Boris Johnson. And this is being exposed now in a politically way, I think. And a lot of people are going to have their minds concentrated. We can't allow that to happen again. We can't allow that to continue.
Yeah, unless there's something else, I think we'll draw that to a close. It's been an absolutely fascinating
Jonathan
session.
says he's got a question.
Yes, okay.
I don't know if he wants to ask it.
Jonathan?
Thanks very much. I just put it in the chat, Guy, but I chatted a lot to NEF, New Economics Foundation, and they were feeling that the right strategy at this moment is to chip away at the bad parts of the welfare state, sanctions, conditionality, at the same time calling for a treble of benefits and kind of move towards a basic income in that way, because believing that it will be harder to go back once those things are achieved, and it will bring us closer. So it's really a strategic question about what the best calls for action are in the next few weeks, months for the Green Party.
I've been dialoguing with Archie Sterling, who is the main author of that proposal. And Jonathan, I strongly believe it's crazy, okay? And I've told Archie, they're good people. They're more on our side than against, okay? But you can't guarantee a minimum income guarantee of £221 a week and then say those would apply to anybody who's not on furlough, okay? Because most people who are on furlough will be receiving less than £221. So it will actually pay them to go off the furlough and become openly unemployed if this scheme was being introduced. But they also rely on means testing. You know, that they claim it's not means tested up front, but it would be means tested afterwards. I don't know how you would do that. Work out after people have been working and earning what they should pay back. It wouldn't be feasible to introduce that new machinery. It would be a new machine. It's no use claiming that they would use universal credit as they do. But when I've been saying earlier, we should abolish universal credit and then say that they're going to do a means test after the event. Just imagine how chaotic that would be, because it has a perverse poverty trap, because it would actually pay not to do any income earning, because you know you would lose the money you were gaining extra, but it would also have an immoral hazard, because it would encourage more people not to declare their extra income. Okay, so for me, any scheme that has moral hazards and immoral hazards doesn't have a lot going for it. They're good people and they're moving in our direction, but not far enough.
It wasn't actually their specific proposal I was asking about, not the minimum income guarantee, but their strategy. So, in terms of, you know,
what's the difference?
Government says, in terms of, okay, so this government right now will probably be in office for 4 years. It's not going to introduce UBI. So the question is, how can we best strategically make the case so there's no going back, so we get closer to UBI, such as, you know, there's been a temporary suspension of sanctions. We try and get that to be permanent. We try and remove conditionality and try and increase the amount of benefits. And so chip away at the worst aspects of the existing welfare state. That moves us closer. And with, we know that the Trussell Trust is going to come out in the next with weekly or monthly stats on food bank use. We know that Citizens Advice is going to come out with monthly updates on the hardship, and we can work with the NGOs and amplify those calls, and then make those calls on, you know, moving those bits of the welfare state. So I'm thinking very, very pragmatically and strategically. We will of course make the big call for UBI all the time, but I'm just looking at what is the route under the current government to getting it, and what the best route is.
60 seconds, please, Guy.
Yeah, very quickly. I've written a paper addressing that question, if you're interested, Jonathan, because I'm basically saying that our position in the short term should be saying, okay, government, you've gone your particular route, but let's do pilots to see if we can actually do a better way forward. I don't believe that the New Economics Foundation proposals actually takes us forward. I think it would be, because I'm going to look at what they actually say, not this general thing. Of course, we can all agree fewer conditions, less, but the real problem is going to be huge numbers of people will fall through the cracks in this period. And the loss of resilience, as I was talking about earlier, will be a loss of resilience for the whole of society. And I don't think that the government measures will stand up, and sooner or later, more of them will come round. Ian Duncan Smith is trying to hold them to the existing one about disincentives to work, when that's how he's trying to rally the Tories. I don't think that will be sustained for very long. We've got the evidence to expose that. But I do think our job in opposition at the beginning of 2020, early 2020, should be to spell out where we want to go. That's your priority. And that is going to enthuse the precariat, is going to increase membership, it's going to win more seats next year in the local elections. If we have a clear position and say, we believe a basic income should be part of this rescue phase, revival phase, restructuring of capitalism phase, and that's where we're putting out our tent. So I think this is not a time for timidity. Now, the Tories, they're a right-wing bunch. They're going to be dragged screaming and whatever in our direction. We shouldn't expect them to come in our direction. So I think this is not a time for compromise. This is a time for mapping out the Beveridge type revolutions. And I think that this is a time, I'm reminded, and I've quoted him in the book, hardly like Milton Friedman, but Milton Friedman made a very prescient point. He said, it's our task, his views were totally different from mine, but it's our task to preserve the desirable so that when it comes, the desirable becomes the imperative, words to that effect. And I think that's where we are at the moment. That's why I have great hopes for a green left future. And I think it's this time we should nail our flags firmly, because you are the party, the Greens are the party who first at national level said we should have a basic income. As I said in my talk, I don't think you were there at the time. I can imagine those leaflets going into the post boxes